Start by folding the yardage of your fabric with selvage edges matching so that you have 2 layers of fabric with the wrong side facing you. Using a ruler and or measuring tape and chalk, mark an indication for 60 inches on the selvage edge of the fabric and 1 on the folded edge of the fabric that is your desired skirt length at the center front plus 4¼ inches. Extend these lines until they intersect and create a rectangle. You should have a double layer of fabric that you will then use fabric shears to cut on your chalk line. With right sides of the fabric facing each other, fold one skirt length edge to meet with the other. Right side should be facing inside. Pin the edges. They should be opposite of the folded fabric edge that you've created. Stitch a seam here after pinning that is 1/2 inch seam allowance at number 2 stitch length. Make sure you back tack starting and finishing this seam. Once you're finished, you will press this seam open and then serge the seam together. After serging, remember to clip all serger tails and thread tails. Using a chalk and a clear ruler, mark 1/2 inch seam allowance indication at one edge of the fabric. You should now have what would be a cylinder of fabric with a seam at the back. Press this 1/2 inch seam allowance toward the wrong side of the fabric. Next, using chalk and a clear ruler, now mark 1¼ inch seam allowance from the edge that you just folded onto the right side of the fabric. Press this allowance toward the wrong side or the inside of the skirt. You will then pin the seam allowance down with pins, which will be directed into the fold of the fabric first to hold the 1/2 inch edge in place. Using a number 3 stitch length, start stitching at the upper folded edge, which was just pinned. Start stitching at the center back seam, back tacking at the start and back tacking at the finish of the seam. Wrong side should be facing you so that you can actually see the folded edge that you're stitching, which should be that edge that you turned under 1/2 inch first. Once you finish this seam, use a seam ripper or thread snips to create an opening in the band that you just created at the seam. This is where you will insert your elastic. You will need to seam rip the stitched part of the seam and the serging inside so that you can actually be able to slip your finger through the opening at the waist. Using a safety pin, fasten it at one end of the elastic and start to feed this through the waistband opening at the skirt back. Once the pin comes through at the other folded end, fasten the 2 ends of elastic together with the safety pin holding it. Try on the skirt, tightening and gathering the elastic and adjusting the pin for a comfortable fit. Mark with chalk or pencil in the spot where you have placed the pin. Using 1½ stitch length, stitch through the 2 layers of elastic where you marked over this same spot 3 times, each time with back tacking. Trim the excess elastic below the spot where you stitched at 1/2 inch, making sure that you measure, mark, and then trim down to the 1/2 inch seam allowance. Using a hand sewing needle, whip stitch the opening at the waist where the elastic was just fed through. Be sure to push all of the seam allowance for the elastic into the skirt so that it's hidden. Your thread for the hand sewing needle should have 2 thread ends. One thread end should be shorter. The longer thread end should have a knot at the end of the thread. Whip stitch, making sure that both folded edges are lined up and you're going through one folded edge through the other using a right to left motion. Be careful to only stitch with a single thread and make sure that you are placing your stitches close together. When you're finished, you will knot this thread using the same technique that we've used for hand sewing with 2 loop knots, and trim any thread tails. To hem the skirt, mark a 1/2 inch on the wrong side of the fabric at the bottom edge of the skirt. You will then press this again, just like the waistband edge, toward the wrong side of the skirt at the 1/2 inch indication. Next, on the right side of the skirt, you will mark a 2-inch line for a fold, which will be your finished hem edge. Fold and pin the skirt hem with pinpoint in the fold. You will then machine stitch with right side facing you the edge that was folded in 1/2 inch first. This is where your pinpoint should be anchored. The machine stitch will be at number 3 stitch length. Try to start at the center back seam. Make sure you back tack starting and back tack ending, catching that edge of the fold. Once you've completed your skirt, remember to press the entire skirt, including stretching out the waistband to press it flat to eliminate any bulkiness. Hang it up on a bottom hanger with clips to be graded.